The morning of June 19th, 1944, over the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu pushed his F6F Hellcat into a nearly vertical dive, the altimeter unwinding so fast the numbers blurred. Below him, a formation of Japanese dive bombers churned toward the American invasion fleet off Saipan, unaware that death was falling from above at over 400 miles per hour. Vraciu wasn't pulling out. That was the critical difference. Every instinct, every hour of training, screamed at a pilot to recover from a dive before reaching the target's altitude. Engage, disengage, climb away. But Vraciu had learned something that transformed American fighter tactics in the Pacific. The Hellcat could dive through an enemy formation, fire during that brief moment of passage, and keep diving. Keep accelerating. Use gravity and 2,600 pounds of Pratt & Whitney engine to build speed no Japanese fighter could match. In 6 minutes, he would shoot down 6 enemy aircraft. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But the innovation wasn't the shooting. It was how he never stopped moving vertically, never gave the enemy a chance to turn the fight horizontal, never allowed Japanese pilots to use the one advantage their aircraft still possessed. For the previous 18 months, American naval aviators had been dying in numbers that filled ready rooms with empty chairs and fleet commanders with cold mathematics. Everyone knew the F6F Hellcat was better than the F4F Wildcat it replaced. Bigger, faster, tougher. But better than the Wildcat wasn't the same as better than the Zero. And until someone figured out how to actually use the Hellcat's advantages, how to translate engineering superiority into tactical dominance, American pilots would keep trading one for one with an enemy that couldn't afford equal exchange. The answer turned out to be brutally simple. Stop fighting the Japanese pilots' war. Fight a war where physics mattered more than skill, where American industrial power could be weaponized through pure kinetic energy. Dive through your target. Never pull out at their altitude. Use speed as both weapon and shield. But getting to that answer required American pilots to unlearn everything they'd been taught, trust their aircraft's structural strength beyond published limits, and accept that winning sometimes meant flying directly toward the thing trying to kill you. When the Pacific War exploded at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States Navy's frontline fighter was the F4F Wildcat. Stocky, underpowered, built like a fire hydrant with wings. The Wildcat wasn't a bad aircraft. It was simply outmatched in nearly every measurable category by the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero could turn inside any aircraft in the sky. Its rate of climb made American fighters look like they were swimming through molasses. And it had range that seemed impossible for such a light airframe, allowing Japanese pilots to escort bombers on missions that should have required twice the fuel capacity. Worse than the aircraft advantage was the pilot advantage. The Zero wasn't flown by academy graduates with 200 hours and a prayer. These were men who'd spent years perfecting their craft over China, pilots with thousands of hours and dozens of kills. Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, names that struck genuine fear into American squadron-ready rooms. These weren't theoretical enemies described in intelligence briefings. These were men who would kill you if you made a single mistake. The early carrier battles demonstrated exactly how deadly the mismatch was. At Coral Sea in May 1942, at Midway a month later, Wildcat pilots had courage and determination in quantities that filled citation paperwork for years. But courage doesn't overcome a 35-knot speed disadvantage when you're trying to chase down a bomber that's heading for your carrier. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, American pilots watched helplessly as Zeros sliced through their formations, exploiting every hesitation, capitalizing on every tactical mistake. The loss rates were staggering. Some squadrons lost half their pilots in a single engagement. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. If the Zero could dictate the terms of engagement, choose when and where to fight, American pilots would keep dying. And the United States would keep losing carriers it couldn't afford to lose. Not in 1942. Not when the Japanese still had the initiative. By early 1943, squadron commanders were sending increasingly desperate reports back to Naval Air Station Patuxent River and the Bureau of Aeronautics. They needed more than incremental improvements to the Wildcat. They needed a fundamental shift in capability. They needed an aircraft that could challenge the Zero on terms other than turning radius and climb rate. The F6F Hellcat that rolled off Grumman's Bethpage, New York assembly line in late 1942 represented the Navy's answer to those desperate reports. It was a fighter built around a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the same power plant that drove the F4U Corsair and the Army's P-47 Thunderbolt. 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, an airframe that could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero into confetti. The first prototype flew on June 26, 1942. By August 1943, barely 14 months later, Hellcats were launching into combat from carrier decks across the Pacific. That timeline, from experimental prototype to operational deployment in 14 months, represented American industrial capacity operating at wartime efficiency. Grumman's Bethpage Plant No. 3 built 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. At peak production, a new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every hour, around the clock. The factory was still under construction, while the first aircraft were being assembled inside. Workers installing lighting fixtures in one section, while pilots were doing acceptance flights from the field outside. But here's what nobody fully understood yet. As those first Hellcats launched into combat in August 1943, raw performance specifications don't win dogfights. The Hellcat was faster than the Wildcat. True, it could dive away from trouble, had armor protection that felt like flying a bank vault compared to the Wildcat's modest plating. But it was also heavier, less maneuverable at slow speeds, and still facing those same veteran Japanese aces who'd been perfecting their craft for years. The question that haunted every Navy tactician from Pearl Harbor to Washington wasn't whether the Hellcat was better than the Wildcat. That was obvious from the test data. The question was whether it was good enough to beat the Zero, and more importantly, whether American pilots could figure out how to use it before the casualty lists grew even longer. The Hellcat's first serious test came on November 23 and 24, 1943, during the assault on Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. VF-1, flying from USS Essex, engaged Japanese Zeros in sustained combat. The results looked encouraging on paper. 30 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of only one Hellcat. That's a 30-to-1 kill ratio, numbers that seemed impossible just months earlier. But one engagement doesn't establish doctrine, it establishes possibility. And possibility required validation through repeated success under varying conditions. Squadron commanders analyzing the Tarawa results saw encouraging signs, but they also saw something that concerned them. Most of those 30 kills came from diving attacks, Hellcats using their superior speed and structural strength to hit Japanese formations from above. What happened when Japanese pilots forced the fight horizontal? When they used their superior turning ability to trap Hellcats in slow-speed maneuvering combat? The data was less encouraging. In horizontal turning fights, the kill ratio dropped dramatically. Not as bad as the Wildcats' 1-to-1 exchanges, but nowhere near 30-to-1 either. The problem was geometric and psychological. American fighter tactics in 1943 were still fundamentally defensive. Even with a better aircraft, pilots were flying cautiously, using the Hellcat's advantages to survive rather than dominate. The Thatch Weave, named after Commander John Thatch, who developed it out of desperation in early 1942, remained the primary defensive tactic. Two fighters flying as a mutually supporting pair. When a Zero latched onto one pilot's tail, his wingman would turn hard toward him, forcing the attacker to fly into the second Wildcat's guns. It worked, it saved lives. But it was fundamentally reactive, a method for not dying rather than a blueprint for winning. Thatch himself understood this limitation. After Midway in June 1942, where his weave helped VF-3 survive against overwhelming odds, he wrote in his after-action report that the tactic was, quote, A last-ditch defensive measure, not a path to air superiority. The THAAD weave required both pilots to abandon pursuit of enemy bombers to focus entirely on survival. Meanwhile, Japanese bombers continued toward American carriers. Every second spent in a defensive scissors maneuver was a second that enemy Vals and Kates got closer to putting torpedoes into flight decks. By mid-1943, Navy squadrons had accumulated dozens of these defensive tactics: the high-side perch, the rolling scissors, the Loughborough circle, an entire vocabulary of survival techniques that pilots studied religiously at fighter training schools in Miami and Jacksonville. But tactical officers like Commander Paul Ramsey, analyzing combat reports at Pearl Harbor, saw a disturbing pattern. American fighters were achieving roughly even exchange rates with zeros, 1 for 1, maybe slightly better on good days. That wasn't nearly good enough. The United States was outproducing Japan in aircraft by massive margins. By 1943, American factories were completing more fighters in a single month than Japan produced in a quarter. But you can't win a war trading aces for aces, veteran for veteran, when the enemy started with better pilots. Japan began the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots, men who'd spent years honing their skills. The United States needed to kill that experience base faster than Japan could replace it. Trading 1 for 1 meant the war would last years longer than anyone wanted to contemplate. The Hellcat gave American pilots new options, particularly in speed and dive performance. But speed alone doesn't shoot down aircraft. You have to convert that speed into firing solutions, into moments where your guns are pointed at the enemy and his guns aren't pointed at you. In late 1943, most Hellcat squadrons were still flying modified Wildcat tactics, tight formations, defensive weaves, trying to turn with zeros when trapped. The results were better than before, certainly better than the desperate days of 1942, but better wasn't the mission. Dominance was. What the Navy needed wasn't another defensive tactic or incremental improvement. It needed an offensive doctrine that turned the Hellcat's specific advantages into weapons Japanese pilots couldn't counter. That massive R-2800 engine producing 2,000 horsepower. The structural strength that allowed 7.5 G positive loads. The high-speed handling that remained predictable at velocities that made zeros shake apart. The answer was already being discovered. Not in classroom briefings at Patuxent River or in tactical development studies at Pearl Harbor, but in the cockpits of pilots who were breaking the rules. Men who were starting to realize that the best way to beat a zero wasn't to fight it on its terms, it was to change the fight entirely. Turn air combat from a horizontal chess match into something vertical, something violent, something that happened so fast the enemy couldn't react, couldn't use their superior turning ability, couldn't exploit years of experience. But that realization required throwing out 2 years of training, ignoring everything instructors had taught about proper engagement tactics, and trusting that physics, raw and brutal physics, would succeed where conventional tactics had only partially worked. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare noticed it first during a scramble in February 1943, months before he'd die in a night combat mission over Tarawa. Climbing to intercept a Betty bomber formation at 18,000 feet, he pushed his F6F into a steep climb and realized something Wildcat pilots could only dream about. He was still accelerating. The Hellcat's R-2800 engine didn't just provide power, it provided excess power. Energy that could be converted into altitude or speed at the pilot's discretion. Energy that remained available even at altitudes where other engines were gasping for air. O'Hare's combat report mentioned almost casually that he'd, quote, maintained climb performance that allowed altitude advantage throughout engagement. That single observation, buried in paperwork that most people would never read, would eventually rewrite fighter combat doctrine for the Pacific War. The physics branch at Naval Air Station Patuxent River started receiving unusual requests in January 1944. Squadron commanders were asking specific questions about dive performance, terminal velocity calculations, structural load limits at high speeds. These weren't theoretical inquiries from engineering students. These were operational questions from men who needed answers because their lives depended on understanding exactly what their aircraft could survive. Pilots returning from combat were reporting that Zeros couldn't follow them in vertical maneuvers. Not wouldn't follow, couldn't follow. The Zero's lightweight construction, the same feature that gave it legendary turning ability in horizontal combat, became a fatal weakness above 350 knots indicated airspeed. At those speeds, the Zero's control surfaces would stiffen dangerously. The stick required force that exceeded what most pilots could apply without risking structural failure. Several Japanese pilots had actually torn wings off trying to follow Hellcats into high-speed dives, their aircraft literally disintegrating from loads that exceeded design limits. Testing officer Lieutenant Commander William Dean ran systematic trials through March 1944, quantifying what combat pilots were discovering instinctively through trial and error. A Hellcat at 15,000 feet could accelerate to 425 knots in a vertical dive while maintaining full control authority. That's roughly 490 miles per hour, fast enough to make the airframe groan and the windscreen blur. Dean's team discovered the aircraft could pull out of these dives, starting as low as 3,000 feet with proper technique. The maneuver generated approximately 5.5 Gs, right at the edge of human tolerance where vision grays and consciousness becomes negotiable. But well within the Hellcat's structural limits. The aircraft was rated for 7.5 G positive loads. Compare that to the Zero's approximately 5 G limit before risking catastrophic failure, and you had a fighter that could maneuver in three-dimensional space that enemy aircraft literally couldn't enter without breaking apart. The Hellcat could go places the Zero couldn't follow, which meant American pilots could choose when to fight and when to disengage. More importantly, Dean's testing revealed climb performance that fundamentally changed. Tactical thinking. From sea level, a Hellcat could reach 10,000 feet in just under 4 minutes at combat power. That meant a pilot could execute a high-speed diving attack, convert his excess speed back into altitude using the zoom climb technique, and be ready for another pass before the enemy formation could reorganize or pursue. It was energy management in its purest form. Potential energy becoming kinetic energy, becoming potential energy again. A cycle that Japanese fighters couldn't match because their engines simply didn't produce equivalent horsepower at altitude. The Hellcat's two-stage supercharger maintained power output up to 17,000 feet, while Japanese radial engines lost roughly 25% of their sea-level power by 15,000 feet. Commander Jimmy Flatley, leading VF5, started incorporating these findings into training syllabi by April 1944. His pilots practiced what they called yo-yo maneuvers, diving attacks followed by steep climbs, never staying at the enemy's altitude long enough to get trapped in a turning fight. Flatley's innovation was recognizing that altitude wasn't just a safety margin, wasn't just the difference between having room to recover from a mistake and dying. Altitude was ammunition. Every 1,000 feet above your opponent represented stored energy you could convert into attack speed, energy you could spend to achieve firing solutions that would be impossible from level flight. And the Hellcat's engine meant you could replenish that altitude faster than the enemy could climb to challenge you. It was energy warfare, and American pilots were flying aircraft that could generate and maintain energy states Japanese fighters couldn't match. The reports coming back from Flatley's squadron showed a dramatic shift in combat effectiveness. Kill ratios were climbing past 10-1, not because pilots were better shots, though gunnery training had improved significantly since 1942. The kill ratios were improving because American pilots were taking shots the enemy couldn't return. They were fighting a completely different war. One fought in the vertical dimension, where American engineering superiority finally mattered more than Japanese pilot experience, where years of combat time over China became irrelevant because the fight happened too fast for experience to matter. Commander David McCampbell was not a man prone to recklessness, which made his combat report from June 19, 1944, so startling. Leading Air Group 15 off USS Essex during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, McCampbell didn't just dive on a Japanese formation. He dove through it. His aircraft entered from 24,000 feet at a 70-degree angle, passed vertically through a formation of Judy dive bombers escorted by Zeros, fired on 3 separate aircraft during the descent, pulled out at 8,000 feet, generating over 5 Gs. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this, and was back at 20,000 feet before the Japanese pilots fully registered what had happened. He'd converted the dogfight from a swirling melee where Japanese pilot skill mattered into a shooting gallery, where he controlled every parameter of engagement. The altitude, the speed, the angle of attack, the duration of exposure, everything. The technique that would become known as boom and zoom wasn't invented on June 19th, 1944. German Luftwaffe pilots had used similar tactics against less maneuverable Russian fighters on the Eastern Front, but American naval aviators refined it into something surgically precise, something that could be taught and repeated and standardized across squadrons. The geometry was brutally simple, but the execution demanded split-second timing and absolute confidence in your aircraft. A Hellcat pilot would position himself 5,000 to 8,000 feet above enemy formations, ideally with the sun behind him to mask his approach until the last possible moment. Then came the dive. Not a gentle descent that gave the enemy time to react, but a near-vertical plunge that built speed to over 400 knots. The pilot had perhaps 2 seconds in the firing envelope, just enough time for a 1-second burst from all 6 50 caliber guns. That's roughly 80 rounds total, 400 rounds per minute per gun. But at a closing speed of over 600 feet per second, it was like firing into a stationary target. The relative velocity was so high that deflection shooting became almost unnecessary. You aimed where the target was, not where it would be, because the engagement happened too fast for the target to move significantly. What made this revolutionary wasn't the dive itself. Pilots had been making diving attacks since the Great War, since fabric biplanes with synchronized machine guns. The innovation was diving through the formation and continuing downward rather than trying to pull up and dogfight. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, flying as McCampbell's wingman that day, described it perfectly in his debriefing, quote, "You're passing through their altitude so fast they can't track you. Their instinct is to turn toward the threat, but you're already 5,000 feet below them before their turn is complete. And if they try to follow you down, their aircraft starts coming apart around 380 knots, while you're comfortable at 420. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was where the doctrine proved itself on a scale that made skeptics into believers. Over 2 days, June 19th and 20th, 1944, American Hellcat pilots shot down approximately 550 Japanese aircraft against losses of only 29 American planes in air-to-air combat. That's a 19-to-1 kill ratio, numbers that seemed physically impossible just a year earlier when squadrons were celebrating 3-to-1 exchanges as victories. McCampbell himself shot down 7 aircraft in one mission on the 19th, each engagement lasting less than 3 seconds of actual combat. His gun camera footage showed the same pattern repeatedly. A dive so steep the camera could barely keep the target in frame, a brief moment of tracer fire converging on target. Then the view pitching skyward as he converted speed back into altitude, climbing away before enemy fighters could react. The tactic solved the fundamental problem that had plagued American fighter pilots since Pearl Harbor. You couldn't outturn a Zero, so don't try. You couldn't outclimb it from equal altitude, so start higher. And most importantly, you never, under any circumstances, fought at the enemy's preferred altitude or speed. Commander John Crommelin, analyzing the Philippine Sea results for Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, wrote in his tactical summary, "We have stopped fighting the Zeros fight. We now force the enemy to fight at energy states where their aircraft advantages become liabilities." By summer 1944, the transformation was complete. Hellcat squadrons weren't just winning air battles. They were systematically dismantling Japanese air power using physics as their primary weapon, using gravity and engine power and structural strength to create engagement conditions where Japanese pilot skill became irrelevant. The math behind a 60-degree dive attack explains everything about why it worked so devastatingly well. When a Hellcat rolls into a dive at that angle, gravity is contributing roughly 87% of the force pulling the aircraft downward. The engine becomes almost secondary, almost unnecessary. The pilot isn't forcing the aircraft to dive, he's allowing it to fall with purpose. At 15,000 feet, a Hellcat in full combat dive would accelerate past 400 knots in approximately 18 seconds. That's adding nearly 230 miles per hour to whatever speed you started with. For a Zero pilot watching from below, that translates to a threat approaching at roughly 680 feet per second. The human eye can track movement. The brain can process visual information and identify threats. But there's a delay between recognition and response, a cognitive processing time that exists for every human being, regardless of training or experience. That processing time is roughly 0.7 of a second for basic threat recognition and motor response initiation. By the time a Japanese pilot's hand started moving toward his control stick to begin evasive maneuvers, the Hellcat had already closed 476 feet and was entering effective gun range. The engagement was essentially over before the defender could begin responding. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was the critical component that made extreme dive attacks both survivable and repeatable. This wasn't a delicate, high-revving power plant that required careful handling. It was 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, displacing 2,800 cubic inches and producing 2,000 horsepower at takeoff power. But raw horsepower was only part of the equation. The engine could maintain full power output at altitudes up to 17,000 feet, thanks to its 2-stage supercharger. That meant a Hellcat pilot climbing back out of a dive attack at 10,000 feet had nearly the same power available as he did at sea level. Japanese radial engines, particularly the Nakajima Sakai that powered the Zero, lost power progressively with altitude. By 15,000 feet, a Zero had shed nearly 25% of its sea-level horsepower, while the Hellcat was still operating at peak performance. That power differential translated directly into climb rate, which translated into how quickly a pilot could reset for another attack. The airframe itself was deliberately overbuilt, engineered with margins that would have been considered wasteful in peacetime. Grumman's engineers had studied early combat damage reports from Wildcat squadrons and made structural strength a primary design goal, even at the cost of some performance. The Hellcat's wing structure could handle 7.5 G positive loads and 3 G negative loads. Those numbers sound abstract, like engineering specifications that exist only on paper, but they became brutally relevant in vertical dive recovery. Pulling out of a 60-degree dive at 420 knots generates approximately 5.3 Gs. If you start the recovery at 4,000 feet, that's enough force to drain blood from your brain toward your legs, greying out your vision, making your arms feel like lead weights, pressing you into your seat with over 800 pounds of force. Pilots described it as trying to breathe with an elephant standing on your chest, as feeling your face sag downward like it was melting off your skull. But the aircraft could handle significantly more. The wing spars were forged aluminum, not weight-saving bent sheet metal. Control surfaces had metal skin rather than fabric covering. When you pulled back hard on that stick at 400 knots, the Hellcat responded predictably. The nose came up, the horizon appeared. Your vision cleared as blood flow returned to normal. The aircraft held together. Compare that to the Zero's reported structural limits, approximately 5 G maximum before risking catastrophic failure. Japanese test pilot Saburo Sakai wrote after the war that diving through 350 knots made the stick feel, quote, like it was embedded in concrete, and that high-speed pullouts generated control forces that were, quote, borderline unmanageable. Several Zero pilots died in 1944 attempting to follow Hellcats into vertical maneuvers, their aircraft literally disintegrating from structural overload. American intelligence reports documented at least 9 separate incidents where captured Zero wreckage showed wing failure patterns consistent with excessive G-loading during dive recoveries. Terminal velocity for a Hellcat in a straight vertical dive was calculated at around 550 knots, though operational doctrine wisely limited combat dives to 450 knots maximum. That still provided overwhelming tactical advantages while maintaining reasonable safety margins. The tactical implication was brutally simple. Structural strength translated directly into options. A Zero pilot watching a Hellcat commit to a dive faced an impossible choice. Follow and risk structural failure, or let the American escape and reset the engagement at his preferred altitude. Neither option was good. Both options ceded initiative to the American pilot, which meant the Japanese pilot was reacting rather than attacking, defending rather than prosecuting his mission. That psychological shift, from hunter to hunted, from aggressor to defender, was as important as the physical performance advantages. Lieutenant Commander Paul Holberg summed it up perfectly in his June 1944 training document. "We're not outflying them. We're not even necessarily outfighting them in pure stick and rudder skills. We're out-engineering them. Their pilots are still probably better in raw aerial maneuvering ability. But we've created a regime of flight where their skills don't matter." The psychological impact of vertical attacks shattered something fundamental in how Japanese pilots understood air combat. Since the opening days of the war, Zero pilots had been trained in a doctrine called Sento Kyote, combat maneuvering that emphasized tight turns, energy conservation through efficient movement, and exploiting the Zero's superior agility. Every engagement began with the assumption that combat would occur in the horizontal plane, with victory going to the pilot who could position himself on an enemy's tail through superior turning. When Hellcats started appearing from directly overhead at speeds that seemed physically impossible, it violated every assumption Japanese pilots had spent years internalizing. Captured documents from late 1944, particularly training materials recovered from Formosa after American landings, showed Japanese instructors struggling desperately to develop counter-tactics. One manual, translated by Navy intelligence in November 1944, instructed pilots to, quote, "maintain constant vigilance above and to never assume the sky above 5,000 meters is empty." That sounds like reasonable advice until you understand what it demands psychologically. A pilot engaged in combat operates on limited cognitive bandwidth. There's only so much your brain can process while flying at 300 miles per hour, monitoring instruments, tracking multiple aircraft, and managing your own energy state. Forcing pilots to constantly check above them meant dividing attention that was already stretched impossibly thin. And even if you spotted a Hellcat at 20,000 feet, what exactly were you supposed to do about it? You couldn't climb fast enough to challenge him before he dove. You couldn't maintain a defensive weave indefinitely while still prosecuting attacks on American bombers. The doctrine placed Japanese pilots in an impossible tactical situation with no good solutions. The attacks from above also exploited a basic limitation of human vision and situational awareness. The human eye's effective field of view is roughly 120 degrees horizontally, but only about 90 degrees vertically, and that's when you're deliberately looking up. When you're focused on threats at your altitude, which is where every previous combat engagement had occurred, your effective vertical awareness drops to perhaps 45 degrees. Hellcat pilots learned to initiate dives from positions that were literally outside the enemy's visual range until it was too late. Commander Charles Stivers, leading VF-11, described it as, quote, "hunting from a hide. You were invisible until the moment of attack, and by then the geometry made evasion nearly impossible." Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences, described the tactical hopelessness in his memoir. After an engagement in October 1944, where his formation lost 6 aircraft to Hellcats without downing a single American fighter, he wrote, "We could see them above us, sitting there like hawks. We knew they would dive. We knew we could not follow them when they did, and we knew that when they climbed back to altitude, they would dive again. We were not fighting pilots, we were fighting gravity, and you cannot outmaneuver gravity." That sense of helplessness was exactly what American tacticians had been trying to create. By mid-1944, training syllabi at Naval Air Station, Maui and Kahului were explicitly teaching pilots to maximize the psychological impact of vertical attacks. Instructions included using cloud cover to mask altitude position, timing attacks to coincide with moments when enemy formations were most vulnerable during turns or altitude changes, and always maintaining enough energy to climb back to attacking position. The goal wasn't just to shoot down aircraft. It was to make Japanese pilots understand that every second they stayed airborne, there could be a threat above them they couldn't see and couldn't counter. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical destruction. Flight operations data from Japanese carriers in late 1944 showed a measurable decline in aggressive tactics. Pilots were becoming more defensive, more hesitant, spending more time checking their 6 o'clock and their 12 o'clock high positions. They were being hunted, and they knew it. October 24, 1944, started like any combat day for Commander David McCampbell. Pre-dawn briefing aboard USS Essex, weather check, aircraft inspection. What it became was a single mission that would validate every tactical innovation of the previous year and produce the most lopsided individual combat performance in American naval aviation history. McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, launched at 07:30 hours to provide combat air patrol over the American fleet during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. What they encountered was a Japanese strike package of roughly 60 aircraft, a mix of Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo bombers, and Zero escorts heading directly toward the invasion fleet anchored off Leyte. Standard doctrine would be to alert other fighters, form up a coordinated defense, attack the bombers while other sections engaged the escorts. McCampbell didn't follow standard doctrine. He climbed. He took his two-plane section to 23,000 feet, positioned himself between the enemy formation and the sun, and watched. He was waiting for the Japanese fighters to commit, to drop their external fuel tanks and engage other American fighters at lower altitudes. When roughly half the Zero escorts descended to engage VF-27 at 15,000 feet, McCampbell rolled into his attack. The first pass was textbook vertical doctrine, a 65-degree dive that built speed to 415 knots, a 2-second firing pass that sent one Judy spiraling downward trailing smoke, then a 4,000-foot pull-out that generated over 5 Gs and sent him rocketing back upward. He was back at 20,000 feet in 45 seconds. The Japanese formation scattered. This was the other advantage of vertical attacks that combat reports had documented but was harder to quantify. When you're hit from the side or behind, your formation knows where the threat is and can coordinate a response. When something tears through your formation from directly above at 400 knots, nobody knows where to look next. The tactical cohesion evaporates. McCampbell's second pass came from a slightly different angle, hitting a group of bombers that had turned west attempting to evade. Another Judy destroyed. Third pass targeted a Zero that tried to climb to challenge him, but was still 3,000 feet below when McCampbell fired. The engagement lasted nearly 90 minutes. McCampbell would dive, fire, climb, reposition, and dive again. Rushing stayed with him for the first 4 kills, then had to break off with fuel concerns becoming critical. McCampbell continued alone, burning fuel at combat power settings that should have emptied his tanks within an hour. By his 7th kill, McCampbell's ammunition was running critically low. He'd fired over 2,400 rounds, approximately 400 rounds per gun. The Hellcat carried 2,400 total rounds, which meant he was operating on the last belt of ammunition per gun. Every burst now had to count. Every trigger pull was precious. His 8th kill came at 09:10 hours, a Zero that he caught in a climbing turn. His 9th came 3 minutes later, another Judy that was so focused on reaching the American fleet, it never saw the attack from above until cannon shells started tearing through the airframe. When McCampbell finally turned back toward Essex, he'd expended every round of ammunition and was running on fumes. His fuel gauge showed less than 20 gallons remaining. He'd been airborne for nearly 2 hours, most of it at combat power settings that consume fuel at rates that empty tanks after 90 minutes. The mission made McCampbell the Navy's top ace of the war. He'd eventually reach 34 confirmed kills, but more importantly, it demonstrated what the new doctrine could achieve in the hands of a skilled pilot. 9 aircraft destroyed, 0 damage to his Hellcat, and he'd done it essentially solo after Rushing departed. The post-mission analysis by Air Group 15's intelligence officer noted that McCampbell had, quote, maintained energy advantage throughout the engagement, never descending below 8,000 feet except during attack passes, and never engaged in a turning fight. Every kill came from a position of overwhelming tactical advantage. Higher, faster, attacking on his terms. The broader Leyte Gulf air battles produced similar results across the fleet. Over 4 days of combat from October 23rd to 26th, 1944, Hellcat squadrons shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 16 fighters in air-to-air combat. That's approximately a 19-to-1 kill ratio, numbers that had seemed mathematically impossible back in 1942 when Wildcats were struggling to achieve 1-to-1 exchanges. The doctrine worked. Vertical energy management, boom and zoom attacks, refusing to fight at the enemy's preferred altitude. It had transformed American naval aviation from desperate defenders barely holding the line into dominant hunters systematically destroying Japanese air power. The vertical attack doctrine that Hellcat pilots perfected didn't end when World War II did. It became the foundational principle of American fighter tactics, encoded into training programs, and passed down through generations of pilots who never flew a piston-engine aircraft into combat. When the Navy established the Fighter Weapons School at Naval Air Station Miramar in 1969, the program that would become famous as Top Gun, the very first tactical manual included a section titled, quote, Energy Management in Vertical Maneuvering. The language was updated for jet aircraft, the speeds were doubled or tripled, but the core concept remained identical to what David McCampbell had proven over Leyte Gulf 25 years earlier. Maintain altitude advantage, convert it to speed during attack. Refuse engagements where the enemy holds positional superiority. Use physics as your primary weapon. Korea provided the first test of these principles in jet combat. When F-9F Panthers and F-4U Corsairs faced Soviet-built MiG-15 seconds starting in 1950, the performance mismatch looked disturbingly familiar to veterans who remembered facing Zeros a decade earlier. The MiG could outturn American fighters at most speeds and had a superior climb rate at high altitude. But Navy and Marine pilots had institutional knowledge that the newly expanded Air Force was still developing. They fought vertically, using energy management techniques perfected in World War II. Lieutenant Commander William Amon, a former Hellcat pilot now flying Corsairs off USS Philippine Sea, shot down 2 MiG-15 seconds in January 1953, using tactics he explicitly described as, quote, identical to what we used in 44, just 200 knots faster. Dive from altitude, use speed to compensate for the enemy's maneuverability advantage, never stay at their preferred fighting altitude. The doctrine's influence became even more apparent during Vietnam. Early in that conflict, from 1965 through 1967, Air Force F-4 Phantom pilots suffered embarrassing loss rates against smaller, more maneuverable North Vietnamese MiG-17 seconds and MiG-21 seconds. The problem wasn't the aircraft. The F-4 was faster, more powerful, carried more weapons. The problem was doctrine. Air Force pilots had been trained primarily for high-altitude interception of Soviet bombers, emphasizing radar-guided missile attacks from beyond visual range. When forced into visual range dogfights, they tried to turn with MiGs. Exactly the mistake Wildcat pilots had made 25 years earlier. Navy F-4 crews, drawing on institutional knowledge preserved through Hellcat veterans who'd become instructors and training officers, maintained significantly better kill ratios by fighting vertically and managing energy. They understood that trying to turn with a lighter, more agile opponent was tactical suicide, better to use your aircraft's advantages in thrust and structural strength. This performance gap directly led to the creation of Top Gun in 1969, The curriculum explicitly studied World War II Pacific combat reports, particularly the tactical evolution from 1943 to 1945. Instructor pilots like Lieutenant Commander Dan Peterson, one of Top Gun's founders, required students to read after-action reports from Hellcat squadrons. The lessons were stark and timeless. Technology alone doesn't win dogfights. Understanding your aircraft's strengths relative to the enemy's capabilities wins dogfights. Fighting on your terms rather than the enemy's terms wins dogfights. Top Gun's famous Fleet Adversary program, where instructors flew smaller, more maneuverable aircraft against students in F4 seconds and later F14 seconds and F18 seconds, was deliberately designed to recreate the Hellcat versus Zero dynamic. Students had to learn experientially that trying to turn with the adversary aircraft was suicide. They had to use vertical maneuvers, energy management, and positional advantage. They had to understand that the fight happens in 3 dimensions, not 2, and that altitude represents potential energy that can be converted into tactical advantage. The vertical attack doctrine's DNA appears in every modern American fighter tactic. The F-15 Eagle's entire design philosophy centers on high thrust-to-weight ratio, phenomenal climb rate, and powerful radar for long-range detection. It optimizes for fighting vertically and maintaining energy advantage, exactly the principles that emerged from Pacific combat. The F-22 Raptor's supercruise capability, allowing sustained supersonic flight without afterburner, exists specifically to maintain the energy state advantage that Hellcat pilots called their altitude bank. Modern pilots don't talk about potential energy and kinetic energy in those terms, but the physics hasn't changed. Even modern aerial combat training emphasizes the same principles Jimmy Flatley and David McCampbell codified in 1944. The terminology has evolved. Pilots now talk about rate fights versus radius fights, about specific excess power and corner velocity, but the underlying physics remains identical. What makes this legacy remarkable is how a tactic born from desperation in 1943 became timeless doctrine that still governs fighter combat in the 21st century. Hellcat pilots weren't trying to establish lasting tactical principles. They were trying not to die against an enemy that seemed superior in the ways that traditionally mattered most in aerial combat. They discovered that their aircraft's strengths, properly exploited, could dominate an enemy that possessed advantages in other areas. That insight, fight your fight, not theirs, use physics as a weapon, turn engineering advantages into tactical supremacy, transcended the specific aircraft and became the foundation of how America trains fighter pilots. Every aviator who's passed through Miramar in the decades since Top Gun was established, every F-16 pilot who's learned energy management at Luke Air Force Base, every F-35 driver who's studied vertical tactics at Eglin is flying a doctrine refined over the Pacific Ocean 8 decades ago. They're using principles discovered by pilots who learned that sometimes the best way to win isn't to be better at what the enemy does well. It's to change the fight entirely, to create engagement conditions where your strengths matter more than the enemy's advantages. The morning of June 19th, 1944, when Alexander Vraciu pushed his Hellcat into that vertical dive over the Philippine Sea, he wasn't just attacking a formation of Japanese bombers. He was demonstrating a fundamental shift in how fighter combat worked, a shift from horizontal maneuvering contests that favored experience and agility to vertical energy management that favored power and structural strength. The F6F Hellcat destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter in naval history. 5,156 confirmed kills, 75% of all U.S. Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories during World War II. 307 Hellcat pilots became aces, pilots with 5 or more aerial victories. 34 of those kills belonged to David McCampbell, making him the Navy's all-time leading ace. But the numbers, as impressive as they are, don't fully capture what the Hellcat represented. It was the platform that finally allowed American industrial and engineering superiority to translate into tactical dominance. It was the fighter that proved you could win not by being more maneuverable or more experienced, but by being stronger, faster in the vertical, and willing to fight a completely different war than the enemy expected. The Japanese Zero was, by many measures, still the superior horizontal fighter in 1944. It could still turn tighter at low speeds, still required less runway for takeoff and landing, still had impressive range. But none of those advantages mattered when the fight happened vertically, when American pilots dove from 20,000 feet at speeds the Zero couldn't match and couldn't follow. The Hellcat's legacy isn't just in the aircraft it replaced or the battles it won. It's in the fundamental tactical shift it enabled, a shift from defensive survival techniques to offensive dominance, from trying to beat the enemy at his own game to forcing him to play yours. Every modern fighter pilot who climbs to altitude before engaging, who converts that altitude into attack speed, who refuses to fight at the enemy's preferred energy state, is executing a doctrine that traces directly back to desperate innovations made over the Pacific in 1943 and 44. The pilots who discovered these tactics, men like Jimmy Flatley and David McCampbell and Alexander Vraciu, didn't know they were establishing principles that would govern fighter combat for the next 80 years. They were solving immediate problems with the tools available, using physics and engineering and tactical innovation to overcome an enemy that had every advantage experience could provide. They proved that sometimes the most important innovation isn't building a better aircraft, it's learning how to use the aircraft you have in ways the enemy can't predict and can't counter. That lesson, more than any specific tactic or maneuver, remains the Hellcat's enduring contribution to American fighter doctrine. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.